All right, we're going to get started, and welcome and happy Wednesday to everybody. Thank you for joining us. Today's theme and presentation is we're going to pivot back to COVID. It's almost hard for us not to address this issue every time we have a webinar, but today we're going to talk about, as the title shows, media in the age of COVID. We're going to talk about really just communication, and in a time where the news cycle and the media is coming at us 24/7 on multiple channels, it's very easy for a local message to get lost there. So while the media is always telling us a story, it's important to be able to tell your story to the media. And today we have with us a presenter who has done a lot of work for national, local organizations. He's done a lot of work for the Florida Association of Counties and some of our campaign work and advocacy. And his name is Ryan Houck. Some of you have seen him at a number of our conferences speaking on campaign issues. He's with Consensus Communications. They are a strategic communications firm located in Florida. And they, again, do all types of strategic communication, campaign work across the country. And so with that, and given his expertise on the topic, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan to introduce the topic and the presentation. If anyone has questions, we have a chat feature. We'll also have some time at the end to answer any questions that you may have. So Ryan, I'm going to minimize my screen to make sure we preserve some of the bandwidth, and welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Eric. I appreciate that. And thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules, especially here late in campaign season, to visit with me and to talk about media in the age of COVID. Some of the things that we're going to cover today won't come as a surprise. Others might be new information. Either way, I hope the discussion that ensues is engaging and enlightening for you. And I'm looking forward to addressing questions and having conversations once we reach the end of the deck. Today, we're going to cover notable trends both on the political side and in the media consumption side over the last several months. I want to address what we call the four forms of media, which are earned media, paid media, shared media, and owned media, and how they've been affected by COVID. I want to talk about a thing that you all have probably done, probably continue to do, and will likely do a lot more of over the coming months, and that is the interview with the media in the Zoom format or the video conference format. And then I want to talk about what we call the positive elements of persuasion in the science of stories, how packaging our pitches to the media, packaging our communications to the general public and to target audiences can be done effectively through storytelling, what the science that underpins that looks like, what the data says about it, and how especially relevant it is right now at a time when the media is obsessed with either the election or COVID, or more likely a combination of the two. So let's jump in with notable trends related to the media. So this won't surprise, but broadcast viewership is up, cable news viewership is up, social media use is up, streaming media is up, radio listenership is down. Obviously, that's because drive time commutes have diminished, except for radio streaming, which is up. Essentially, COVID has caused a spike in most forms of media consumption. All of that's intuitive when people are spending more time at home, less time out at bars and restaurants and theme parks and so forth. They're just going to consume a lot more media than they have in the past. And this creates new communications opportunities for those of us who are in the business, the industry of communication, but also new challenges. I also want to address some of the, the polling related to COVID, because this is the climate in which we're communicating, and I think it's relevant for any discussion about how to reach target audiences or to reach the general public, during this period. So the first is this is a chart from 538, deals with how worried ordinary Americans are about infection from COVID. And as you can see here, there's a spike right here in March, which is about the time everyone learned just about how serious it was. But I think the notable takeaway here is how very stable these lines are over the ensuing months. With all the volatility in the national media with all of the confusion and controversy surrounding the elections, you still have a relatively solid number of people who say they're very concerned, somewhat concerned, not very, or not at all concerned. And there's not a whole lot that's changed that opinion. You can see here on the very concerned, there's a dip early in summer, and then a spike as we head into August, and then kind of a regression to the mean, which is more or less where we are right now. The next slide is kind of a similar story here. Again, this is economics. How worried are you about the virus's effect on the economy? Again, you have this surge early on in March. You get to a majority of voters who say they're very concerned, and it stays there right up to today. You got 32% who say they're somewhat concerned, only a handful who aren't. Now, this is notable for a lot of reasons, but probably the biggest is that after a few years of the economy being a receding concern and other more traditional quality of life concerns increasing in importance, we're now seeing a very sudden and very real return to economics being the primary driver of voter concerns and voter priorities. That means how we address them should take this into account. Things that deal with the economy, things that deal with jobs, these are going to be instantly relevant to voters in a way that probably mirrors the Great Recession, 2008 through 2010 or thereabouts. And in the last few years, we'd seen kind of a decline in economic concerns. And now, in tandem with COVID, we've seen a resurgence in those concerns. So the last chart I wanted to show you from a polling standpoint deals with the president's response to the virus. So as you can see here, you've got very early on in the process, here we are in March, we have an uptick in the number of disapprovals, but it's pretty tight. And then as everything everyone reverts to their very tribal nature, we see a return to a kind of mid-50s disapprove, low 40s approve, which more or less mirrors the president's overall job approval rating. So early on in the process, people aren't entirely sure what to make of the president's performance. They're not entirely sure what to make of the virus itself, but without much time passing and only a matter of a couple months, people have figured out. They've sorted themselves into their traditional groups. And of course, if we were to put partisan trend lines over top of this, none of it would surprise you. But people have sorted themselves into their views on the president's handling of the virus, more or less based on their views of the president himself. This is the last piece of polling I wanted to show you deals with, this is back from September, so it's somewhat recent, and I doubt it's changed a whole lot. You can see here that the top issue is this kind of basket of social issues, which is everything from healthcare to climate change, to education, to race relations, some of which are extremely relevant right now, given the protests and so forth. But right behind it, you've got the virus at 25%, kind of roughly matching the strength and intensity of this basket of social issues. And then behind that is economic. And that's of course probably why y'all are, if you're not running re-election campaigns right now, you're probably seeing a lot of ads on TV and stuff in the mail that's about economics, and that's about COVID, especially if they're in the positive. So let's talk about how COVID and the changes that it's brought about have altered how we communicate. I want to look at it through the lens of earned, paid, shared, and owned media. Earned media is talking to the press. It's cable news, it's local news, it's print news, it's talk radio. You earn attention by delivering newsworthy information. So the pros are that it's reasonably credible, and it's reasonably low cost. The cons are that it's filtered through the filter of the media and whatever bias or opinion or news objectives of the organization are at play there. And it's also infrequent. You might get an earned media hit every few weeks or every month or something along those lines, but it's not something that you can do every day reliably in a manner that's consistent with your message all the time. Paid is advertising. it's TV, both broadcast and cable. It's digital, it's radio, it's direct mail, etc. The pros are that it's direct and frequent. You can advertise as much as you like. The cons are that it's less credible than having it published in a third-party source, and it costs money, of course. The next is shared. That's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, everything like that, social media. These are platforms where dialogue or conversation is not only the norm, but it's expected. It's part and parcel of the medium. You can deliver content in this medium, but you can't really control what happens to it. You can't control how people respond to it and comment on it, and you can't control how they share it or don't share it. So this is very much a shared space. The pros are that it's low cost, and in certain circumstances it can be credible, because information shared by trusted friends can be more valuable and credible than information coming from a third party. The cons are that it's uncontrollable. It's often a kind of a repository for complaints. You don't hear a lot of good news breaking on social media. And in many circumstances, it's not credible. While you might trust the opinions of a few certain select individuals, you may not trust their opinions on everything. And then, of course, on the wide variety of situations, you wouldn't trust most of the opinions shared on Facebook or any other social media platform. Lastly is owned. That's your email list. It's your city or your county's newsletter, your podcast, your publicly owned local channel, et cetera. The pros are, of course, that it's low cost. It's credible with many audiences because of who you are, a local government delivering fact-based and timely information. The cons are that it's pretty narrow band usually. Usually these media aren't ways that you reach the general public writ large. You might be able to reach certain highly attentive members of the public. So I want to explore each of these and how it seems that COVID has affected how we do these things. First is earned media. How's it changed? Well, events are suddenly very problematic. That's why we're doing this as opposed to meeting in person. The print media, which was already on the ropes as a result of changes to the media landscape, is stretched thinner than it ever has been before, and that makes it much harder for them to focus on any one particular issues. Some writers and editors may even face once per week or once per month furloughs, and this can affect what they're writing on and how much time they have to devote to that writing. In many cases, they're being assigned stories that they have no control over, so pitching reporters isn't even what it used to be in terms of getting them to actually spill ink on your topic. A lot of times, in order to replace the lack of an event visual, you now need to supplement video content of your own. And so if that's something that you all have not done already at a county level, at a government level, you probably want to be thinking about having internal events, or kind of alternatives to press conferences in video form and packaging that for the media in a way that's kind of soup to nuts. Most TV outlets are now willing to do interviews via Zoom or Skype, and so mastering that particular medium is important. And then, of course, COVID and now national politics dominates the news. So your story is either part of that, or it is an alternative to that, and it should be pitched as such. Your personal relationships with reporters, you either had them going into this, or you're going to have a hard time building them at this point unless you become a reliable source for them on issues that they're already writing about. It's just tough to go have a cup of coffee with someone or lunch with somebody that you've not previously met. How's it the same? Well, a lot of business was already conducted by text, by phone, and by email. So fortunately that hasn't changed, and it's all been remote for a while, especially with reporters. Existing relationship with reporters are at a premium. So using relationships to call on reporters to pitch positive news is still possible. We've had success doing it at various times, but they're a lot more limited in what they can do. And just like everybody else, they're consumed with national news related to the election or related to COVID or secondarily related to the economy. So news angles that tie into what the media is going to want to cover already are probably the best way to pitch stories. It's just that there's a narrower frame of vision for the media, given the fact that there are these huge stories out there right now, which kind of command the attention of the national media: COVID, race relations, explosive presidential elections, and so forth. As far as what was changing anyway, newsrooms were already shrinking. They were becoming less expert because reporters were having to cover multiple different beats. You know, you used to have someone who was covering the education beat. You used to have someone who was covering the tourism beat. Now, usually it's somebody's covering that, plus local government, plus state government. Everybody's stretched thin, so everybody's less expert. The opportunity in that for you is to find ways to become a reliable source for the media. As a local government, as an elected official, as a PIO, you're well positioned to do that already. And if you haven't, you might want to consider thinking about local news outlets that are already covering COVID and thinking about pitching them your stories about how at the county level you've responded to COVID, how it's affecting local residents and businesses, and what the county leadership is doing to address it and to get through it together. These are all not just ways to pitch stories, obviously, during COVID, but ways to become a reliable source at a time when members of the media are desperate for reliable sources. So paid media, how's it changed? Well, Nielsen says that on average, people are consuming about 60% more of it than they were before. And that consumer behavior has been reprioritized to reflect, changes in spending resulting from the economic consequences of COVID. An obvious example of that would be everyone buying hand sanitizer. So that's kind of reorganized the type of advertising that we see on media. And then, of course, there's the barrage of political ads that are underway and have been for a couple months, and it's difficult to break through them. Ad creative, of course, also needs to be sensitive to the time that we're in, respectful of the fact that many families either have lost loved ones or know folks who've lost loved ones, and that it's really important that any advertising, any messaging in general, not appear exploitive of a tragedy, but that it be sensitive to a tragedy that in many ways is continuing to unfold. How's it the same? It's still the most reliable way of persuading people because it offers you an opportunity to speak in unfiltered fashion to your audience. The best truism of communication is that saying something once doesn't really get the message across. Saying it 10 times does the trick. Advertising is really the only medium where you can say something 10 times to one person. And usually once you've done that, the message has sunk in. And whether it's persuasive or not, they'll remember it, they'll recall it. And that's kind of a key advantage of advertising that remains the same. And it still offers the broadest, fastest, and most effective way to reach people. There are a lot of advantages to advertising. The disadvantage, of course, being cost. What was changing anyway? Well, digitization is the obvious trend. That was already underway. But I think kind of the subheader of this election, at least, is that TV remains king. It's harder to get a message through on broadcast television than it's ever been before, but it's still easier to do it on broadcast TV than it is anywhere else. And that includes, Facebook, any form of digital, mail, radio, et cetera, you name it. There's this continued fragmentation of media consumption and a breadth of choices that's arisen that's really affected how people consume media too. It used to be that there were only a few electronic media. There's broadcast TV, cable TV, radio. And then Dish and DirecTV came along and they were bumping along the bottom with fairly low market share. And now there's kind of been an explosion of streaming services. They've bitten off a chunk of the cable market. They're nibbling into radio as well. The increased use of addressable TV via cable and targeting via streaming services like Hulu, for example, are pretty good examples, by the way, of where I think television is headed. Television being the biggest and most powerful medium, it's interesting that it's becoming more and more focused and targeted. I think that could change, obviously, the cost equation, but also, turn it away from being a shotgun approach to more of a rifle approach. Technology is not there quite yet, but it's on its way. As far as shared media is concerned, how's it changed? Well, there's more consumption of it during COVID, just like just about everything else. Like earned media, particularly Facebook, it's dominated by discussions of COVID, by discussions of the presidential election, and by discussions of race relation. How's it the same? Well, it does pretty much what it does. The only thing that's changed is the amount of time that people are spending on it. And was it changing anyway? Yeah, content policing, content restrictions. This is kind of a brave new world that we're entering in terms of what people are even allowed to say on social media and how these social media giants are responding to misinformation, or as some might suggest, what they perceive to be misinformation. So that's a debate that our society has yet to put to rest, and that will continue to rage, but we're now finally seeing social media companies police content in a way that heretofore they have not, and that's certainly changing political stuff, but it probably is likely to change advertising and communications on social in general. And then lastly, owned media. How's it change? Well, extra care and attention really needs to be spent so that any communications, especially those that you wholly control, are sensitive. Sensitive to economic concerns and the health concerns of the present moment. How's it the same? It's still your content. And the challenge remains making it relevant to listeners and readers and viewers. What was changing anyway? Well, paid texting has become more commonplace, but it's not any less irritating. And now it provides links to other content. This is kind of this cycle. We've certainly seen a lot of paid texting, and that being an owned medium, something that you can communicate with people via text. I don't want to say it's a new development. It's been going around for a while, but it's a kind of a new addition to the owned media pantheon. And I find it irritating as hell, but hey, maybe that's just me. So let's talk now about meeting the media in the age of COVID. What are the best ways to communicate with them, especially if you're in that Zoom interview? Well, first, there are a few tried and truisms that are important, and they're relevant whether or not it's the age of COVID or it's pre-COVID. But emotion typically trumps reason. It's always been the case. Everyone always says it in politics. Now there's a lot of data to support it. People retain about 5% of the roughly 3,000 messages that they receive on a daily basis. And most of those messages are emotional or nonverbal signals. It's not what you say, it's how you say it. Of course, is as true as it's ever been. And that's why accidental messaging can be really, really damaging. Look at some of the debates that have taken place on the national stage, whether it's interrupting or sighing or eye rolling or whatever the case may be. These are probably not intentional messages, but they're sending really loud signals. And that's something that in this age we need to really, really be cognizant of. In fact, there's some good data now to show that as far as what people recall most about speakers or presenters, or those who they see in a news style interview setting, body language is of course the biggest, and everybody knows that crossing your arms is the classic closed off body language, and touching your fingertips is the classic nervous body language. But being attentive to your own body language is highly relevant. And just as being attentive to your tone of voice is highly relevant, because only 77%, of the overall message is coming from your word choice selection. And mostly when it comes to word choice, you just want to be careful of not saying something insensitive that's going to get repeated, replayed, and thrown back in your face. But mostly you need to be thinking about that body language, especially in any sort of visual medium. Before an interview, as always, you should learn as much as possible about the interview request. If you've got a PIO, that's his or her job to help you with that and to prepare support materials. You want to study the reporter, his or her work, study the news outlet. The more you understand about the goal of that particular news outlet, the easier it's going to be to determine the type of coverage you're going to receive. And you should go in every interview, not just knowing what types of questions you're going to get asked, but knowing what you are going to get out of it. Why Why are you doing the interview? There's always a risk reward to it. Anytime that little red light turns on or that microphone goes hot or that pen comes out, there's a risk involved. And you should know what your objective in any interview is going to be, and you should know that before you go into it. So you want to determine what you want to get out of the interview. You also want to ensure that your internet connection is stable. You want to consider your backdrop. And especially at a time when people are doing a lot of Skype interviews, people are doing a lot of Zoom interviews, it's really, really important to secure the interview site. And this will give you a good idea of why.
Scandals happen all the time. The question is, how do democracies respond to those scandals?
And what will it mean for the wider region? I think one of your children has just walked in. I mean, shifting sands in the region. Do you think relations with the North may change?
I would be surprised if they do. Pardon me. My apologies.
What's this going to mean for the region?
My apologies. South Korea's pop.
And there we go. Anyone who doesn't feel bad for the guy just doesn't have a heart. I have a 4-year-old Disney princess at home. I'd be lying if I told you she didn't once or twice interrupt some of my my Zoom meetings. But that's obviously something you want to attend to. People are more forgiving of it than they used to be for obvious reasons. But certainly in your role as a PIO or as an elected official, you want to be mindful that the door is closed, that there aren't any external sounds to the extent that you can prevent them. Maybe put a sign up on your door, whatever the case may be. Now, during the interview, try to be disciplined, but try not to be robotic. I've seen too many interviews where they're a little more than a regurgitation of talking points, and you might as well have emailed your answers to the questions to the reporter or to the interviewer. That's not what you want to do. Anytime you're appearing in a Zoom or a Skype call, you want to bring news, not just talking points. That doesn't mean you should deviate from it. You need to be disciplined about it, but you need to make sure that you're not selling talking points, you're adding value. Their job is to sell newspapers. Their job is to sell advertising space on television, whatever the case may be. Help them do their job, and they're going to have you back on. If you don't do that, it's going to be a lot more difficult to pitch the next story that you want to pitch. Questions or, of course, opportunities to speak, even repetitively sometimes. They're not just requirements that you answer the question that was posed exactly in the manner that was posed. Sometimes you'll get loaded questions or baited questions. That's a topic for a whole different discussion. Obviously, you want to be mindful of those, but it's okay to say, you know, especially if you've answered the question, that you appreciate the question the first time it was asked and your answer is going to remain the same. It's also okay to return to time-tested message. You just want to make sure that you're addressing the subject matter that the question has been asked about. And if you don't like the question, it's okay to occasionally suggest what type of question should have been asked. I just wouldn't make a habit of doing it every time you're asked a question. Try to stick to the subject matter that the reporter wants to cover, and make sure that you're adding value to the interview, not just trying to sell talking points that could have been conveyed by email. You want to avoid absolutes as much as you can. Never and always are good examples of absolutes. You shouldn't really ask, you shouldn't really answer hypotheticals. You should always rephrase questions unless you're perfectly comfortable with the entirety of the question being attributed to you in the way that it was phrased. Most importantly, in these media, everyone's feeling their way through it. The experts have been doing it only for a few months. So be honest, relax, be friendly. These are probably the most important qualities in any of these Zoom or Skype interviews. And that's going to get you through 90% of the job. During the interview, try your best to maintain eye contact. It's always difficult to know exactly where to look, whether it's the camera, you're looking at your notes, or your screen, or whatever the case may be. Do your best to at least periodically return directly into the camera lens. If you want to demonstrate that you're sincere and that you're really engaged in a point, you can obviously lean forward. Leaning back demonstrates that you're at ease and you're comfortable, but sometimes can signify that you're disengaged and you don't really want to do that, depending on what the topic is. Outside of the interview, you want to remain on guard. It's always better to say that you don't know than to commit to a poor position. And you want to be mindful of the default expression on your face. Sometimes you think it might look goofy if you just have this relaxed default smile on your face, but I guarantee you it's usually better than the alternative. And just to prove it to you, I'll give you an example of an alternative. This young lady didn't have any media preparation going in, and no one told her that she should have a pleasant expression on her face at all times.
Much more.
Carla Delevingne is in the movie. She joins us live from New York City to talk about Paper Towns. Cara, good morning.
Hey.
Hi, how you doing?
We're doing all right. Nice to have you here. So the movie is based on a best-selling book by John Green. You play Margot, the star character there. Did you get a chance? The book is taught, I know, in a lot of high schools and such. Did you get a chance to read it, or do you even have time to sit and read? These days you're so busy.
No, I never read the book or the script, actually. I kind of winged it.
Yeah.
No, of course, I love the book. I
Nice
think
try.
the book's amazing. John Green is an incredible author. So really, if you haven't read his books, you should. Really, don't miss him.
You know, I'm wondering, looking at, as Marianne was talking about how busy you are, and looking at your IMDb and all the projects, it's like you are doing one thing after the next, after the next. Do you find that it's easier for you to focus because you're so busy? If you had downtime, maybe it wouldn't be so easy for you? What do you think?
No, I don't know where that comes from. No, I think it's not easier to focus. I mean, I love what I do. It's not crazy. You know, I mean, it's my passion, all of these things. You know, I've wanted to do this since I was young, so it's not due.
So there you go. Not just the body language, not just the lack of a pleasant default expression on her face, but kind of responses that drip with sarcasm. The other thing to remember is just because you're not live at any given moment doesn't mean that you're not being recorded. This is the CEO of a major company that's going through $1 billion acquisition, and this is the song that he intentionally or unintentionally chose to sing during what he thought was just a unrecorded commercial break. Let's spend it, rolling. We're in the money, the sky is sunny. Let's lend it, spend it, send it, rolling. So there you have it. So at this point, I want to transition to punching through, or trying to punch through, at a time when news coverage is dominated by COVID, race relations, economics, the presidential election, all things well beyond our ordinary control. And I want to start with what we just call the positive elements of persuasion. So several years ago, Dr. Paul Zak, who's a neuroscientist who studies brain chemicals, conducted an experiment in which he drew blood from subjects while they watched different videos. The purpose of the experiment was to study which story elements released which brain chemical. Now, building on Zak's work, David J.P. Phillips, who's a noted author, summarized 3 natural chemicals in our body that help produce positive behavior, like empathy, trust, focus. Now, we've talked about interviewing with the media. We talked about reaching audiences during a pandemic. We're talking now about how best to tell stories. So we should begin by addressing these 3 chemicals and how they help you persuade. First is dopamine. Dopamine is known as the feel-good neurotransmitter. It engenders focus and motivation. Studies have found that we can get the brain to generate this chemical by telling stories that contain suspense, because human beings crave to know how something ends. It's hardwired into our DNA. So think about movies or literature, plays. When storytellers leave us with questions, we tune in to see the next episode. And so an example might be an old man's walking through the woods at night. In every direction, the trees are tall, ancient, and grim. The ground is slick with rain and muck, and in the distance, a pale light shines in the window of a small cottage. A tall stone chimney spouts black smoke into the autumn air. The old man is tired, hungry, and wet, and now he's desperate. So desperate that he approaches the door of the cottage, knocks on it timidly, and then loudly, and then waits. Something stirs within. The knob turns, the door opens, and the old man gasps. So I'm not going to finish that story, but neuroscience tells us that it's probably already created dopamine in your brains, and that's giving you added focus. And that as we go through this talk, I'd like you to think about how creating a little bit of suspense can help craft outreach campaigns in your community. Now, the second chemical is oxytocin, which among other things fosters generosity, empathy, trust. It's usually created through personal storytelling. That's why your motivations and the events that lead you to make a decision are not only relevant, they're essential elements of persuasion. And then finally, we have endorphins. They make the audience feel creative, relaxed, focused. You can generate them by making people laugh. And sometimes just watching laughter is enough to do the trick. So if the baby doesn't make you laugh, I've got nothing for you, and I apologize. So I want to talk about how this relates to the science of decision making. We're talking about how to present stories to people. We should also be mindful of how people make decisions, usually based on limited information. The word heuristics comes from the Greek. It literally means to discover. It's how people, when presented with only a little bit of information about a subject matter, try to find information shortcuts and make decisions with it. 95% of all decisions are made quickly, automatically, unconsciously. In fact, you formed opinions about me the moment you saw me, regardless of anything I've said before or after. Now, a good example of this would be the Golden Arches. What is it? Everybody knows what it is. But without there being any words on the screen, you already know what you can do here. You know what you can buy here. And you know what you want to buy here. And that's an example of heuristic reasoning that is effective. An example of ineffective heuristic reasoning would be, I love burgers, therefore I would love a veggie burger, which is false because I personally think they're gross, and heuristic reasoning would have failed me there. Most of your audience members are using heuristic reasoning as information shortcuts. Another example would be this. If you're over 30, this is a floppy disk. If you're under 30, it's the save icon. How do you know, though, when you click it, it won't just eject the floppy disk or order you a package of floppy disk? Again, it's an example of heuristic reasoning. It's past experience standing in for present experience. So it's intuition, it's profiling, it's stereotyping, it's a gut feeling. And maybe the most prominent and relevant examples at the moment are these: Republican and Democrat. They're not perfect information shortcuts, but they can tell you a lot about a candidate, and a lot of voters rely on these simply to decide where they're going to be sitting. So when you're developing a story, you want to think very actively about what information shortcuts are going to be available to people when they read it. They're not going to go do all the background research. So what kind of breadcrumbs are you leaving out for them to engage in the type of heuristic reasoning that people always do when they have limited time and limited information? The most important piece of this is that the human brain isn't it's not a story process. Excuse me, it's not a logic processor, it's a story processor. And Jonathan Haidt, is a PhD and social psychologist at NYU, said that. And I've always thought it was extremely relevant. These information shortcuts rest on deeply held worldviews. And so how do you change someone's worldview? You tell them a better story. And our whole society is based on it, from Odysseus to Gilgamesh to Luke Skywalker. It's all about stories, because the way the brain is mapped, it allows us to process stories very, very easily. Our brains process them through something that neuroscientists call frames, which stick in our brain through memory and to which we attach very, very powerful emotions. These frames form our worldview, our politics, our religion, our values. And when we encounter facts that don't conform to these frames, we don't reject the frames, we reject the facts, because that's just how our brain's been hardwired. So Will Storr, a journalist and educator, explained in 4 parts this phenomenon: change, cause and effect, moral outrage, and the eudaimonic. And I've adapted them to these categories for our discussion. Change. We're biologically in tune to changes in our environment. Think about a loud noise behind you or a sudden change in the weather. Psychologists call this attentiveness to change an orienting response. And we're in a constant process of orienting and reorienting ourselves to our environment. This has evolutionary value. It keeps us alive. And great stories tap into this, which is why stories often begin with change. Think about Luke Skywalker. We meet him as a farm boy on a backwater planet that no one's ever heard of. But before you know it, he receives a famous call that signals change and puts the rest of the story into motion. Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. How about politics? Successful politicians often organize speeches or entire campaigns around the idea of change. How often have you heard or even uttered the phrase, "We are at a crossroads"? This signals change. And right now, obviously with COVID, massive change is underway. So addressing that change and helping people through it is usually a useful predicate to storytelling. And we have cause and effect. How does change beget more change? Why are people so invested in stories that begin with and revolve around change? Well, our brains had evolved at a time when human beings lived in tribes, and cooperation was essential to survival. So how does a tribe cooperate? A society of only a couple hundred people tops. It probably does it in a lot of ways, but one is gossip. Gossip promotes the development of social conventions, a shared notion of what's acceptable and what's not, a shared morality. Some scientists actually think language could have evolved simply and primarily for the purpose of spreading gossip, because it has an immediate value to the survival of the tribe. Did you hear what happened to Og when he got too close to the quicksand? Did you hear what Grug did to Ugg? Why gossip instead of data? Well, there's no scientific method. Just didn't exist. So stories were our way of passing along important information about the world and the reality around us. It's why stories, even about things that seem like black and white scientific concepts like COVID, are what we tell ourselves. It's how we make sense of our reality. It's our poor beleaguered tribal brains trying to live in the 21st century. A gossip also helps create a sense of justice and outrage. We start to see some people as villains and some people as victims, and sometimes ourselves as victors in these stories that we tell. I think every political campaign is probably an example of that. And that's true of this increasingly common notion of politics being the story about good and evil. Why do we think we're smarter or better looking than we are? Because we're the heroes of our own stories. Our brains are almost hero-making machines, and we divide the world into good and evil intuitively without really actively thinking about it based on those stories and narratives. Take a look at our politics today and tell me that it's not true. So what does the brain want then? What do audiences want? What do they need, especially in times of hectic change like right now? They want control. Stories are a way of gaining control. Since the dawn of time, we've been coping with a world around us that's constantly changing, and we tell stories to manage that change and determine our places within it. Change is a fact of life. It's terrifying, and story is a form of play that lets us control it, which is why all of our messaging right now should be in the form of stories. And so I'll close by telling you about the way I would probably approach any new communications initiative that you were going to pitch. Instead of pitching new initiatives based on what they do, think about pitching them in terms of what you can do with them. When we surround ideas, projects, campaigns with good stories, do we make them more appealing, or does it not matter at all? Well, you can tell me. So in 2009, 2 writers, Rob Walker and Josh Glenn, conducted an experiment. They bought $129 worth of thrift store trinkets online. They drafted a writer to imagine a story for each object and then to write that story. Each object was then placed on eBay for resale along in the description with that accompanying story. The crew's original $129 worth of junk was resold for over $3,600. And that might sound amazing, but think about it. Human beings invented stories around 100,000 years ago, and Francis Bacon perfected the scientific method about 400 years ago. Which one do you think our brain is better able to process? So that's it for me today. Unless you all have questions, conversations, angry recriminations. Eric? Eric, I think you're still muted.
Thought by now I should have gotten used to this. Can I take you back to the beginning of your presentation, and you were talking about, I wrote the numbers down, body language being 55% during an interview. I think the language was 7%, and the tone of voice 38%. I mean, it seems, there it is. It seems to me that, you know, even when we come out of this pandemic, this is going to be kind of a, we're going to be living in this sort of hybrid work environment, and we're going to be communicating through this type of medium, I think, going forward. So in terms of when someone is interviewing over, you know, Zoom or whatever it might be, how do you think those numbers change? And what is really more important? Is it the eye contact? Is it my tone? Is it moving the hands? What can you recommend in that area where, you know, most people are going to be talking to the media through this platform probably for a while?
So it's a good question. I think certainly for news interviews, body language may be the most important, with tone of voice closely behind. Word choice, the fact that it's 7% seems to suggest that we shouldn't be attending much to the words that we use, and that's not true. What I mean is the thing that people recall the most are not the individual words that you chose, unless they're sensational. And that's because people are attuned to recognizing cues beyond words. We've been recognizing tone of voice and body language for a lot longer than we've been recognizing the spoken word. And our brains are just hardwired as a result to respond to it faster. So if you have a tone of voice or a body language cue or word choice that is out of the ordinary, that's the type of thing that people are going to recall. And the best thing I recommend there is to do the interview, record the interview, and share the interview with friends and family. Have somebody practice with you even on Zoom before you do it. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, you should find a real devil's advocate to ask you tough questions on Zoom, to record you, and then you should play it back. It is really the only way of getting genuinely better at it. I mean, frankly, I've always hated doing that. But back when I was doing a lot of direct media, that was the most important way to improve and to keep yourself sharp. And when you're not doing that, I think you're losing your edge a little bit.
All right, you're suggesting just like practice in advance before.
Over and over again, yeah.
Okay, that's good advice. The other thing I wanted to, again, go back to, you're talking about in terms of a recommendation, in terms of try to avoid answering the hypothetical, try to avoid being absolute in your response. And, you know, I'm fortunate to have a public information officer here who basically told me after the fact. So when we were doing a phone interview with a reporter on a piece of legislation at the Capitol, it was very easy for me to just keep talking to keep the conversation going. So are there a couple, besides practicing, are there a couple other tips or recommendations in that world?
Yeah, so I always say you have to be comfortable with silence. And a lot of times good reporters, at least back in the day, they would ask you questions, you'd give your answer, and then they would remain silent and wait for you to try and fill the gap with unneeded words. And that's where if they're smart, they're going to give you that opportunity. And if you're not paying attention, you might let them take advantage of it. So be comfortable with silence. When you've completed your answer, stop speaking. In addition to that, when you get a media call, I've always done this and I've always found it to be useful, and I advise clients to do it too. You're usually not in the frame of mind where you can sit down and focus and talk to a member of the media unless you're perfectly comfortable. And you almost certainly haven't thought about what you want out of that interview, which is another thing that we talked about. You should be talking with your PIO before you do any interview. What do we want to get out of this? To some extent, yes, you're an elected official, so interviewing with the media is a part of the job, but you should be getting something out of it too. The organization should be getting something out of it. You should be talking about what you want to convey. And so what I usually do is I get a call. I tell them I'm not in a position to speak right now, but I'll call them back in 5 or 10 minutes. I take that time to compose myself, to think of those 2 or 3 things that I want to accomplish in the interview. And I make sure I accomplish them without doing any damage along the way as best I can.
I'm trying to sit with the silence to be comfortable with it. That's kind of a nice segue to relationships with reporters. And you talked about there's, a shrinking pool of them and others are kind of falling outside of their expertise. I think there's a trap there that I think, maybe a newly elected commissioner or a PIO has to, one, establish that relationship. But again, this is outside my world, but my guess is that you've got to make sure when you're on the record or when you're off the record that arm's length distance is there. So any advice on just establishing relationships, but being careful?
Yeah. So, on deeper dives into media, we go into what is on the record, what's off the record mean, what's on background mean, what's deep background mean. And there are these are terms of art that carry with them certain expectations, but those expectations aren't always universal. Craig could certainly tell you that. So anytime we're going off the record with a reporter, I like to be very clear about what that means, unless I've worked with the reporter before. And generally reporters don't like being off the record. By the way, going on a diatribe and then saying, oh, that was off the record, isn't off the record. That's too late by then. Make sure you've established the parameters of your interview or your comment before you give the interview and make the comment. And you can't retroactively do it. A lot of reporters won't respect that. But in terms of developing a relationship, they're people like anybody else. Do they have inherent bias? Sure, we all have inherent bias. Usually that in and of itself isn't enough to result in a bad story. They are driven by the goals of their organization, just like you're driven by the goals of your organization. And so the best way to manage them is to develop a personal relationship, but to be mindful of at all times that they are still driven by the goals of their organization, even when you're having a beer with them, and that you are too. And I think they know that, and you should just be aware of it as well. And when you're going on the record with them, just be clear that you're doing it, and be clear what the parameters are before you do that.
Good.
You can't over communicate, in my opinion, when it comes to setting those parameters.
And this is probably going a little too far, but I know what I heard on the radio last week was when the president was in the hospital. There was communication from the doctor, and then the chief of staff decided to talk to the reporting pool off record. Mm-hmm. But what he didn't realize was a camera was rolling. And so the information he was trying to get out off the record got out, and everybody knew who communicated. So going back to what you said before, be careful, whether you're singing We're in the Money or something like that. I guess the cameras could be rolling, and so you got to be.
Well, that's another thing. If you're the communications director at an organization who only has one communications person, and you go on background with somebody and they're able to name you as, not give your name, but say a communications person at such and such county, there's a pretty good chance that, just like in the Mark Meadows example, people are able to deduce who that senior source was or who that communications source was. So you just have to be careful that a reporter may be adhering to the letter of the law, but there may only be a few guesses as to who the source is. And so you just need to be mindful of that risk anytime you do it, and seek clarity. If you don't have clarity, better to ask the question and be on the same page with the reporter than to not ask it and get burned later.
Right. Your last thing, and I know it was just a couple of slides, and I bet you could probably do a full symposium on it, but it's the science of storytelling, telling a better story. And with everyone so entrenched right now in different silos, and everyone's very tribalistic, both politically and socially, how effective is kind of the structure that you laid out in terms of telling a different story to really persuade the person who doesn't care about the facts?
Yeah.
been? I mean, because I think that's fascinating.
I don't mean to sound crass, but nobody cares about the facts. And I realize I probably just offended half the people listening or watching. But what I mean by that is not that you can't be persuaded by data, or not that you don't have a reasonable mind, or that you're an analytical person. It may be that, you know, respecting science is just higher on your priority list, and that's an essential part of your worldview. Whereas it may not be for somebody else. And so you may take pride in that element of your personality, and therefore force yourself to attend to facts more than most people do. But that doesn't mean that you're not subject to confirmation bias or any of the heuristic shortcuts that advertisers routinely utilize to persuade people. Every time I do focus groups, I watch people lie to me about how negative ads don't work, but then I watch them dial on negative ads. And of course they work. That's why you see them all. This is what the market has demanded. You know, it's been said before that I think George Bernard Shaw said, this is a democracy. We get precisely the government we deserve. That's true of advertising too. We get precisely the advertising we deserve. It's what we ask for. It's what we respond to. So when you say people that don't respond to facts, I just kind of say, well, that's everybody, because everybody's brain evolved 100 years ago or 100,000 years ago, not 400 years ago. We didn't evolve around the scientific method. We evolved around storytelling. Storytelling was how we gave people in the tribe vital information. And it is still the most effective method of persuading people. So if you want to change someone's deeply held view, don't bombard them with facts. Include facts in your really good story. And the elements of story, you know, I put them here. And you're right, we could spend a lot of time talking about it. It is a really fertile ground for conversation. But these are the elements of stories that make people pay attention, that we know, scientifically speaking, release certain chemicals that make them focus and open their minds to creativity and to a change of mind. And that's a story that they can slide into their worldview rather than directly challenge an existing worldview. By the way, great example of that would probably be, you know, the youth smoking campaigns, you know, back in the 90s and early 2000s, when all of a sudden, all of the media and all the advertising, you know, we pulled down all of the tobacco advertising, and government started spending a lot of money on advertising, all against tobacco use, against smoking. And it did change the culture. It had a profound effect, and it was done through telling stories about individuals who had suffered as a result of smoking. And so, yeah, they presented facts along the way, but the thing that moved the needle were the stories that those facts conveyed. And that's what I would recommend to anyone who's trying to communicate in a really charged, really partisan environment, where people are always trying to figure out, okay, where's my tribe on this particular issue? Don't look to just chuck facts at people. Look to find a way to tell them a story that they can believe and that they'll find compelling, and include facts as a part of that story.
Right. Well, I think that is the end of our questions. Just for those that are on the webinar, if you've got friends or colleagues or any other person that wants to review this, we'll have it uploaded in a couple of days, and it'll be saved on the ICG webpage. So feel free to watch it again and see it. And if you have other more specific questions, feel free to reach out to Ryan at Consensus Communications. And as always, Ryan, love working with you guys. Appreciate all the stuff that you do for Florida Association of Counties, and want to thank you for coming on today. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Eric. Good to be with you.
All right. Thank you.